Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. It's all about, well, how mice learn to find their way through mazes.
Yeah.
And what's really cool is how this might actually give us some clues about like better ways to teach people. We've got two really interesting sources to dig into today. One's like a straight up research study from a lab that's been, watching mice do their maze thing. And then we've got this blog post that takes those findings and kind of connects them back to like how we learn in school and stuff. Ready to dive in.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is going to be a fascinating one. We often just assume that the really complex stuff about learning is like unique to humans, but sometimes looking at how simpler creatures, learn can give us some pretty surprising ideas about how learning works for, well, everywhere.
So let's get right into it. This research paper, they describe how they made this super complex maze, like a real labyrinth, for mice. And some of these lucky mice, they got a little bonus. There was like a water reward hidden somewhere in the maze.
Yeah, and what's really important here is how the researchers let the mice just explore, on their own. Like the spontaneous behavior, that's a key part because it shows us how they naturally learn and solve problems without being, forced to do specific things.
And get this, these little guys were seriously fast learners.
Hmm.
We're talking about mastering the maze after only a couple of times finding the water. I mean, I still get lost in IKEA, and these mice are out here conquering these complex mazes. It makes you think, like, what's going on in those tiny mouse brains of theirs?
I know, right? They weren't just running around randomly. They were actually like demonstrating a real understanding of how the maze was laid out. Not only did they find the water, but what's even more impressive is that they could find their way back out with barely any wrong turns.
But here's where things get really interesting. The researchers noticed that some mice would suddenly, like, just get it. They'd go from seeming totally lost to navigating the maze like, well, like total pros in a split second. They even called these moments, get this, eureka moments. Mice having aha moments, just like us.
Yeah, these eureka moments, they suggest that the mouse's knowledge is like suddenly crystallizing. It's a point where they suddenly grasp, the whole structure of the maze. It actually could be very similar to how we humans, have those aha moments when we suddenly understand something.
So is it possible that what's happening in their little mouse brains is like kind of similar to what happens in our human brains when we learn?
It's definitely a possibility, and it really highlights this important idea. Not all learning is, the same. This study compared how quickly the mice learned the maze with how they did on these things called two alternative forced choice tasks.
Okay, so what exactly are two alternative force choice tasks? And why are they important in this, like, whole comparison thing?
Imagine you're given two options and you have to pick one right, and then you find out if you were right or wrong. That's basically what these tasks are like. It's a really controlled type of learning. And what's interesting is that the mice weren't as fast at learning these tasks. It took them way longer, and they never got as good at them as they did with the maze.
So it's like the mice didn't really get what the point of these tasks even was. Almost like they weren't, I don't know, motivated to learn them.
Exactly. It's like these forced choice things just weren't, meaningful to them. There wasn't really a purpose, not like the maze.
Yeah, it's almost like the mice were thinking, what's the point of all this? Which brings us to our second source today. It really digs into this whole idea of learning having to be, like, meaningful. The author makes this really cool connection between the mice in the mazes and, well, how we think about education for people. Just like those mice did so well in a natural maze,
Yeah.
maybe students learn best when the challenges they're facing are, gauging and actually mean something to them.
Yeah, the author brings up a really good point about, the way education is usually done. Think about those classes we all had to take, right? The required ones. They often felt like, I don't know, chores, didn't they? Just like those forced choice tasks for the mice. We were told to learn stuff, but the connection to what we were interested in or our goals, well, it wasn't always there.
It's like being stuck in this boring maze with no reward at the end. No wonder we didn't always feel like super motivated in those classes.
Exactly. And to make it even worse, the author talks about how a lot of these educational chores, they come with this added pressure of getting grades. They actually call them graded chores, highlighting how that constant pressure to be evaluated can actually get in the way of exploring and really learning.
Hold on, graded chores. I never thought about it like that. Tell me more about what they mean.
Well, think about it. When you're always worried about getting the answer right or getting a good grade, does it really make you, curious or make you actually want to learn?
Yeah, I see your point. It becomes more about just like doing what you're told than really understanding. Remember those pop quizzes we used to have in high school? Oof, talk about pressure. No wonder some students just like lose their interest in learning altogether.
That's exactly it, and it ties back to those mice, you know? Imagine if they were constantly punished for taking a wrong turn in the maze. Do you think they'd be as excited to explore and learn how it's all laid out?
Probably not. Being scared of making mistakes would probably make them like way more hesitant and less willing to try different things. Which makes me wonder, how do we design better mazes for learning, like in classrooms and just in life in general?
The blog post actually has some really interesting ideas about that. First, they say we need to shift the focus away from just memorizing stuff and towards, like, understanding the main principles and how they apply in the real world. It's kind of like teaching the mice about the concept of shortest path instead of just memorizing a specific set of turns, you know?
So it's about teaching the why behind the what, right? Giving the information context and meaning. Instead of just memorizing facts, we actually learn how to use the knowledge. That's pretty powerful.
Exactly. And the second thing they talk about is encouraging exploration and asking questions. Think about how those mice were, like checking out every little corner of the maze. That's how they learned so quickly. We should be encouraging students to do the same. Get curious, ask questions, make mistakes, and learn from them.
So instead of just, giving students the answers, we should give them the tools and the freedom to figure things out for themselves.
That's the idea. And then the third thing is about the feedback we give. Instead of just saying right or wrong, we should be giving feedback that makes them think critically and helps them get a better understanding. It's like guiding those mice with little nudges instead of forcing them down one specific path.
I like that analogy. It's about helping them become like active learners, not just passively taking in information. It seems like actually engaging with the material is key. But how do we make learning actually relevant to people's lives? Does the blog post talk about that too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They talk about how important it is to connect learning to real problems and situations that, actually matter to students. It's about helping them see the connection between what they're learning and why it's important in the real world. Like, think of it as putting that water reward in a spot that makes sense to the mouse based on its instincts.
Yeah.
They're going to be way more motivated to find it, right? Because it has a real purpose for them.
So it's about showing students how the knowledge can be used to solve real problems that, like, actually matter to them. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And to really show what they mean, the author uses this really interesting example with pH titration.
Oh, right. The pH meter analogy. I was wondering when that was going to come up.
It's a perfect example of how, actually doing something can really help solidify your understanding. The author compares just like calculating pH in theory versus actually using a pH meter in a lab.
So it's like you can read all about pH in a textbook,
Mhm.
but when you get to use a pH meter and solve a real problem, that's when those abstract concepts actually click.
That's exactly it. The author says that both ways of learning have value, of course, but when you actually apply something to the real world, it often leads to a much deeper, more intuitive understanding of, the basic principles behind it. It's like it turns it from just a mental exercise into something that actually means something, and that's what really makes it stick.
So if we zoom out and think about everything we've talked about, what are the biggest takeaways from these amazing maze-running mice?
I think the most important thing is, realizing the power of tasks that are like intrinsically motivating. When learning feels relevant and engaging, like navigating that maze to find water, it seems like the brain just, lights up and absorbs information way more easily.
It's like those eureka moments the mice had, those moments when everything suddenly makes sense. They're such powerful learning tools.
Absolutely. And this research is like really valuable for educators, or honestly, for anyone who's involved in teaching or learning in any way. It gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we can create learning experiences that are, more effective and engaging.
It's about designing those mazes, whether they're literal mazes or just the challenges we face in learning. It has to be meaningful and engaging, not just a bunch of hoops to jump through.
Exactly. If we focus on, teaching the core principles, encouraging people to explore and ask questions, giving thoughtful feedback, and making sure what they're learning is connected to the real world, well, we can really help learners experience those eureka moments and develop a deeper, more intuitive understanding of, well, anything they're learning.
So to wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. What if we redesigned traditional classrooms to feel more like a meaningful maze? How do you think that would change things for students?
Imagine a classroom where everyone's encouraged to be curious, where it's okay to make mistakes and learn from them, and where, knowledge is presented as a tool to actually solve real problems. That's the kind of environment that could really help every student reach their full potential.
And hey, maybe we can all learn a thing or two from those amazing maze navigating mice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those eureka moments coming.